From 1998 to 2004, I worked as a teacher and an administrator in the Oakland Public Schools, and I loved my time in Oakland. In fact, it was in Oakland where I arrived at my moral focus, like Simon Sinek's why, like why I get up every single morning. I even dedicated my recent book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership and After Action, to the children of Trailer C. Trailer C was my home away from home. It was a magical place with some of the smartest, most creative, and curious children I had ever met. Their families were among the hardest working and loving humans, all of them working tirelessly to provide their children a promising future. In cities across the country, the resources found in public schools have everything to do with the socioeconomics of the neighborhood. If you visited a city school like the one I taught at in Oakland, you're not likely to find a music program, an art program, a library, a media program, or even a full-time nurse for that matter. If art or music or library existed, it was because the teachers brought them to their classrooms or to the school. And in my third year in Oakland, I was a roving teacher. And this meant that I had my own class of children, but because of overcrowding, I didn't have my own classroom. Our school had 750 kids, but only room for 550. So every 3 weeks, 1/4 of the school went off cycle. And like the volleyball games of my youth, the teachers without classrooms would rotate to a new space. And that was me. My kids and I would pack up everything every 3 weeks and move to a different classroom. Whenever I see a line of ants on a sidewalk, it makes me think of my class, sort of following me as I push 2 massive rolling cabinets to our next temporary home. And it was in that year, my third year, that I had a chance meeting with a guy named David Fadig from the U.S. Coast Guard. He was assigned to me for a junior achievement done in a day event. And after a full day of teaching lessons on civics and economics, which, by the way, my favorite part of the day was walking the kids to lunch and Dave's astonishment that we'd need to eat, use the bathroom, and prep for the afternoon in only 25 minutes. And his eyes were wide, like, you do this every day? Yeah, teachers do this every day. So after a full day, though, we were seated on an old wooden chair, and he watched as 4th and 5th graders started to arrive in my classroom for instrumental music lessons. You see, my public school in Long Island, New York, started teaching instrumental music in 4th grade. I played woodwinds throughout high school and college, and even now I play alto sax in a pep band for the Seattle OL Reign. Dave played trumpet in the Coast Guard band, and together, with 5 of his bandmates, we started teaching instrumental music. And the Allendale Elementary School Band in Oakland, California, was even highlighted on the CBS Sunday morning show with Charles Osgood. I still stay in touch with Alma, who played clarinet for the nation, and by the way, has read my book, and so check out the show notes for a photo of one of my most favorite students. Such a heartwarming story, right? I've always been so proud of the music program we brought to Allendale, and then after recording a conversation for this podcast with Joe Batory, I felt conflicted. He's my guest this week, and he told me about the successful lawsuit that Pennsylvania school districts brought against the state's legislature because of how the Pennsylvania legislature broke its promise of equitable funding. And it raised my hopes that other states might choose to follow a similar path. And I was frustrated that for all these years, I looked at our little band and thought, oh, how wonderful it was. And it was. But it didn't have to be this way. Looking at you, California, Prop 13. We all know we are lucky to whom we are born. But public education shouldn't rely on luck. Every child is entitled to attend a well-funded, well-resourced public school. I've always said that you can't aspire unless you've been inspired. And when you systematically cut funding to the most vulnerable, you get exactly what the system was designed to create. Systems of inequity, hopelessness, a reliance on charity and grants. I will always look back on my time in Oakland with fondness. I loved being part of the creation of an elementary school band with the U.S. Coast Guard. And you know what? We owe it to our children and their children to do better. My guest today, Joe Batory, is a celebration of an incredible career. It's an episode of great stories and reflections. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Joe Batory is my guest. Joe is an unusual superintendent, and I'll get to that in a minute. But to begin with, he had a 15-year run as a superintendent of Upper Darby School District, located just west of Philadelphia, which is not that unusual. But he has written many academic pieces. He's given many such speeches. He much prefers telling stories about his real-world superintendent adventures, and one being his roots. Rising up from the inner city streets of Philadelphia, he's had a remarkable career, leading one of Philadelphia's largest school systems. And when he retired, one newspaper called him a legend, another termed him a champion for children and education. And I think we're in for a ride today. So, Joe Batory, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you very much.
So, Joe, I have 1,000 questions for you. But first, let me tell you why I wanted to talk with you. It was a simple sentence in the middle of a thoughtful and really a moving piece. It was entitled The Lesson of Four Boxes. And you wrote, "Great teachers are change agents." Now, I often refer to teachers as activators of knowledge, and it may be the same thing, perhaps. I wonder, would you tell us the lesson of four boxes and how that applies to teachers?
Well, this really started when I started graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, pursuing a doctorate in education, and the first professor I ran into was a Marxist. And he proceeded to say that in many classrooms, too many classrooms were just validating socioeconomic inequality. So that if a student comes and is academically talented and ambitious, they tend to do well. If they're average, they tend to get lost. And if they're kids with baggage and problems, sometimes they stay with baggage and problems. They get validated that way. And I thought that was outrageous. My heritage is Polish, and I have no use for Marxists or communists. They subjugated us for 40 years. So I started arguing with this guy. And at graduate school, the eyes were real big, and these students were looking at me and saying, "This guy's crazy," arguing with a professor. And I really got nowhere and ended up getting a C in the course, which is a failure. But then as time went on, and
that C was for capitalist, you know that, right?
Yeah, probably.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Okay.
As time went on, I started to see something in what this professor said. And I just wanted to make sure, and you can't generalize classrooms. There's too many different things going on. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure, and the teachers working for me, that they understood this idea of not being a validator of socioeconomic inequality. So what I did was in my opening speech to 1,000 members, secretaries, principals, teachers, workers, transport workers, I had four boxes on the table on the floor in front of me. One was a beautifully wrapped, magnificent box with jewels on it and ribbons. Another one was just simple wrapping and one ribbon on it. The third one was wrapped in brown paper with twine. And the fourth one was in tatters. It was in newspaper, it had been torn to shreds. And there's a lot of murmuring before I started speaking, 1,000 people saying, "What is this man? Is he going crazy? What are these boxes?" But then I just told them that I have just one question for you. Can you care about and treat each of those boxes equally? And that stirred up a lot of talk. And we proceeded to talk about that in the speech, and not validating young people for where they are, but looking at them for where they might be or what they might become. But there was something to what that professor said. We got to be careful that we're not validating young people where they are, and rather looking at them for where they might be or what they might become.
Yeah, this is a really, one could say we don't judge a book by its cover. You actually had sort of these pieces out there, that these tangibles, as a way to really be able to use that as a metaphor for our children. And I imagine you would likely agree that we know through whether it's research out of Rutgers or out of Georgetown, that the number of words that a child hears based on their socioeconomics does impact their test scores and things like that. What you're saying is, don't judge that child's capability, intelligence, and likelihood of success based on where they come from, but rather recognize every child has hopes, dreams, and potential, and we're going to do our very best to make sure they reach them.
You just gave my speech message. Very good.
Did I? Oh man! All right. Well, I feel good. Well, you've published a number of things, and I found this pretty interesting. You've published a piece that included the importance of mentors, and even if they come from the most unlikely of places. So I started the introduction saying that you were an unusual superintendent, because this is kind of an interesting story. In fact, you wrote, and if you're comfortable, would you mind reading what you wrote?
Well, let me give you the context of this first. I grew up in Southwest Philadelphia, a very poor neighborhood, Catholic, very Italian, but all poor people. And nobody was going to college. There were other opportunities. At the time, the neighborhood was run by the mafia, and there were no lotteries, no state lotteries, no government lotteries. So the mafia ran the lottery. It was very lucrative. They had young people out of high school who went door to door, rang doorbells and said, would you like to buy a number? 10 cents, 25 cents. You could buy a number. Then there were drawings every other day, and they had people supervising, making sure it was legitimate. And they actually paid people if your number won. So all I wanted to do after high school was go to work for these people. The reason is that most of the young men who were working for them, picking up numbers, collecting money, delivering, had cars and pretty girls. So what I was interested in were cars and pretty girls. But I had been rejected by 4 colleges with good reason, because my standardized SATs were terrible. But LaSalle College, now a university, accepted me. And so on my street lived the leader of the mafia, Guido. And I was just hoping to get in his good graces and become one of his workers and runners. But this is what he said to me. He had heard that I'd been accepted by LaSalle, and he said this: for heaven's sake, Joey, you're never Joe or Joseph. You're in Italian, you're always Joey. You're one of the first around here to ever get admitted to a prestigious college like LaSalle. So why would you throw away that opportunity? He argued. Besides, you would be a representative from us people in the real world. You didn't have no silver spoons growing up, so you could be a role model. You could inspire kids from our neighborhood to reach upward. What a difference you might make as a teacher or a principal. So forget about running numbers for me. You're not going to do it. So that was part one. I had received an acceptance packet from LaSalle, which was shocking since I had been rejected by 4 Philadelphia, other 4 higher education places. And Guido showed up at my house and grabbed my mother and father and said, Joey's going to sign the acceptance package from LaSalle tonight, and we're going to mail it together. My parents were just elated. Guido was smiling, my parents were smiling, and I was completely terrified. Not what I wanted to do, going to a foreign land like a college and with all kinds of foreign subjects taught and all that kind of thing. It was just too difficult for me. Anyway, that's what we did. We filled out the papers, mailed it in, and everybody was jubilant, and I felt like I was trapped on a tree limb, ready to fall to the ground and be destroyed. So that was the influence of Guido, big time. I can tell you that at LaSalle, it was extremely difficult because of my poverty. No one told me I'd have to buy books. So when I got to LaSalle, I had no money left for books. So I really am very embarrassed, borrowed books from other students at lunch, read like a fool, like crazy, and actually got through my first year at LaSalle without books. And so, as you said, Peter, in the beginning, it was a very unusual mentor, someone from the mafia, telling a young man that he could become something better and perhaps be a teacher or a principal.
What I found incredible in terms of that story is what you said about mentoring. And you said, the bottom line is that mentoring matters monumentally, especially for those young people who need support the most. The empathy, motivation, and guidance for me from a very unlikely source, coupled with LaSalle's acceptance of me as a student, changed the course of my life. And my question for you is, it's such a captivating story. What did you learn about mentoring from this unmanageable and unusual mentor? Those are your words, by the way, unmanageable.
Well, I remember a Broadway musical, I'll bring that up, called How to Succeed in Business. And it was a wonderful actor in there.
I'm glad you didn't say Guys and Dolls. I was going to say, this is a little bit on the nose now.
This was Robert Morse, who was working in the mailroom and going nowhere. And he would sing to himself and say, I believe in you. And that was a Broadway song. And he did that all the time whenever things got bad. But the real mentoring is not that way. It comes from other people who say, I believe you, and can pick you up and help you and pat you on the back. And when things are down, make you feel better. That's the magic of true mentoring.
In the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension called the collective aspiration. And that's really just the heart of the organization's work. And inside that dimension is a term, compelling purpose. What this speaks to is really Peter Senge's 2 questions. What do we want to create together, and how do we want to be together? And I imagine when you first became a superintendent in Upper Darby, you had to come together to figure out what it is that you wanted to accomplish for children. Say a bit about Upper Darby School District, and which you became superintendent in 1984. What were some of the challenges you faced, and how did you begin at arriving at this compelling purpose?
Well, this job in Upper Darby was one that none of your listeners would ever want to undertake. In 1980, right before that, the years previous, there had been 3 strikes, 2 teacher strikes and 1 strike by secretaries. Ugly things, spray painted cars, terrible coverage, kids out of school for a month. And on top of that, the enrollments were going down. So the current superintendent then in 1980, he and his wife unilaterally, and this is a good advice for listeners, decided which schools would be closed because of the declining enrollment. They did that in their living room. And on Monday, he announced 3 schools that would, all neighborhood schools that would be closed, and all hell broke loose. The community went crazy, the press went crazy, screaming, yelling, board meetings. He ended up with a heart attack. He said that he charged that the board didn't support him. They said, "We're supporting you, go retire." So that retired him. They put a new superintendent in who liked me. I was going to leave, and he put me in charge of personnel, which was not a great thing because there were 4 unions, and we had all that trouble in the past, and 1,000 employees. But again, it was another man who believed, another mentor who believed in me and said, "I believe in you." And he was much more inclusive, and he got some schools closed without all the screaming. He managed to bring order to the school district. And in 1984, he had a heart attack. So think of that. In 1980, superintendent has a heart attack. 1984, a mentor to me has a heart attack. And the school board at the time said, we want you to become the superintendent. Well, would you really want a job like that where 2 men had heart attacks on the job? And on top of that, it was very political. The school board at the time was totally Republican, controlled by a Republican machine in the neighborhood. And so, being young and crazy, I got a meeting with these political people, 2 very, very powerful Republican leaders. I mean, like the leader of the Pennsylvania Senate and another one who was in the White House all the time, communicating about getting votes from Upper Darby in the area. And I met with them in a diner before, and I told my wife, I said, if I'm going to tell them that they're not going to tell me what to do, and if they say they are going to have to tell me what to do, I'm just going to turn down the job and we'll go somewhere else. And she said, fine, that's fine. So I did that in the diner. I told these 2 power figures, you're not going to tell me what to do, and I have to have my own way and my own vision and that type of thing. And John McNichol, the powerful boss, started laughing uproariously and laughing and laughing and laughing. And I said, well, I'm a dead man. It's been nice dealing with these politicians, but I'm a dead man. And when John finally stopped, he put his hand up and he said, let me explain something to you, that if we wanted an idiot to be the superintendent, there are plenty of idiots in the Upper Darby School District. We could have picked any one of those idiots. So we picked you because you have brains and we want you to do things and change the school district for the better. So, but before you think there's no strings attached, we have only one condition. And that is whenever you do any major change, an innovation, a curricular thing, whatever, schedule, we'd like to know because we're going to get the calls. And it would be good if we can say, oh, yes, we've talked to the superintendent and we know what this is about. And here's the reasons they're doing it and so on. So we played that game for 15 years where we did a multitude of changes. And I had this wonderful communication. I would sit down and say, we're doing this because, and this is why. And they would be able to answer to the public. And it strangely worked out well. It's kind of a political anomaly, something good actually happening, but it did.
So you enter this school district with pretty clear guidelines or parameters for yourself in terms of what you were going to accept. And I found that interesting in that, yes, you have 4 unions to negotiate with and recognize that there was great power in those unions. And these 2 individuals who were very steeped in the political machine with powers that ran all the way up to the federal level, to the executive branch. And there had to be some real communication and collaboration. And so the original question was about compelling purpose. And I imagine while in the 80s, you didn't call it that, but this was a very collaborative process in terms of as you were moving forward for the betterment of children in Upper Darby, where they had seemed to have been the casualties in lots of bad decision-making in the past. What was one way that you did that certainly communication. That was one significant way.
That's a big one, and that's the one I want to stress. And what I did when I got into the superintendency was spend all my time in schools. I spent days in schools, not an hour visit, but I spent the day in the school and visited 20 classrooms and ate lunch with the teachers and just saw things and was observant. They call that management by walking around, I think. And that's what I was doing. But I went to every place and saw so many good things. But the school district was not well respected or liked or whatever. And it occurred to me that we weren't communicating well at all. The cliche goes something like this: you do a good job, you do a good job, you do a good job, and then you tell people. And so many people, teachers that I talked to, said, "Oh, we don't have to do any publicizing. We just do a good job. We know it's good in our hearts." This was insane. There were too many good things going on. And so that's the culture, the main culture change.
That's a great example. I mean, just in terms of telling your story, I think in public education, we shy away from doing that. And then we allow others to write a narrative about just how incredible we are.
The other cliche, you're right on the money. The other cliche is, if we don't tell our story, who will?
And we'll be right back. In the many conversations I've been having with leaders all across the country, there are some themes that keep popping up. And one is the fact that children are really having a hard time engaging in school. And one big part of that is the phone that's in their hands. Schools around the world are seeing the damaging effects of phones on student engagement, social development, mental health. Yonder is a company that has developed a unique product and program to allow schools to become phone-free, from arrival to dismissal. Learn why 1 million students use Yonder every day. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. Go to overyonder.com to learn more. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Joe Batory, former superintendent of Upper Darby School District, located just west of Philadelphia. And in this segment, we usually ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they have made, and then we discuss it. But today I'm going to take a different approach. And instead of sharing one scenario, I'm going to ask Joe a series of questions about what happened and what he learned. So here we go. So Joe, first question. As a new superintendent of schools in Upper Darby, you decided to initiate your own personally funded scholarship. And you've admitted that you did this for the wrong reasons and that things went immediately wrong. I know, because I'm on your mailing list now, now there's some really great things that are happening. So it wasn't always wrong, but it sounds like initially it went wrong and then things improved. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. That the first time coming from poverty and being the boss of the school district and the highest paid person in the school district, I thought I should really give something back. And so I told the high school to set up a scholarship that I would fund, and that they could pick the student, just get somebody who has a financial need and promise. And I don't want any part of the selection. So Upper Darby, it's a huge high school, the largest in Pennsylvania with almost 4,000 kids. They have a senior awards night. And aside from the colleges that give thousands of dollars in tuition reimbursement, scholarship things, this is Upper Darby's own scholarship program. Right now, it's about $400,000 a year that goes to kids, aside from all the college money. And so the kids are told that they're going to get an award, and they don't tell them what it is or from who or whatever. So it's senior awards night. It's 1985, somewhere around there. We have 200 kids on the stage, all dressed to the hilt. Their parents are there. Everybody's smiling. It's happy. And they're calling out scholarships and giving kids these awards. And it's a joyous night. And it's getting toward the end of the night, and they call out the Joseph Batory Scholarship, and the person's not there. So I was sitting next to my high school principal, Gil, and I said, Gil, if you would like to keep working here, you better find out tomorrow morning in a hurry where that kid was. So the next morning, sure enough, he calls. I was embarrassed. He calls and says, you better come over to the high school. And I said, no, just tell me. No, you got to come to the high school. So I went over to the high school, went to his office, and then he's inside, and he's got this little Vietnamese girl, like 5 foot tall, bawling her eyes out, saying, I am so unworthy. I am so unworthy. And I thought, what the hell is this? Gil says to the little girl, the senior, you tell the superintendent what happened. And she said, I'm so sorry. My family came from Vietnam. We had nothing. We came on a boat. It's been so good to us in Upper Darby here. I'm going to go to college. And they told me I would get an award, and I didn't believe them. I thought, why should I get an award? I am so undeserving. And I told my family, and they said, someone is playing with you, making a joke with you. Don't you dare go to that. So she stayed home. So by this time, I'm crying. Gil Manasseh's crying, my principal. It's quite a scene in the room. And finally, after a while, I just got up and stood her up and gave her the scholarship money and said, the only person not worthy here is me, and you are very worthy and you will do well in college. And it was a great lesson in humility for me. I had done this for all the wrong reasons. My head was real big in giving my own scholarship instead of thinking about some kid who I could make a difference for in her life.
One of the areas that newer superintendents struggle with is school finance, especially when it comes to how states create their formulas. The formula, for those who are not familiar, refers to just how much the state will send to your district for every child enrolled in the school. And I mean, and attending, because you see, schools are only paid when children actually come to school. It's called ADA, average daily attendance. So funding formulas are tricky, and they're political. So in your case, when the Pennsylvania legislature tossed its nationally recognized fair funding formula for public education called the Equalized Subsidy for Basis Education, what decisions did this force on school boards and on superintendents? And really, I'm kind of curious, what did you do?
So here we go. Never dreamt anything like that could possibly happen. Pennsylvania had a 50% rule. The state would pay for 50% of the cost of public education. Local property taxes, would pay for the other 50%. They did not distribute the money equally from the state, that 50%. They had an equalized method so that, for example, I'll just throw some numbers out there. If you were an affluent white suburb, you might get $1,000 for each student from the state. Upper Darby, which is more diverse, might get $1,500. Philadelphia might get $2,000. That's the way the money was given out, but it totaled 50%. Well, the state politicians figured out this was costing money. So 50% became 48%, became 46%, became 44%. And it literally brought school districts to their knees. For superintendents, you really had two choices. One is to cut programs. Say you're missing $2 million from your $40 million budget. What do? Well, you cut programs, or you raise the local property taxes. And in my case, this is something I say you have to figure out what is worth falling on the sword for. This is something I was going to fall on the sword for because I was not going to hurt kids. So in the back room, I told the school board one night, I said, if you try to cut programs, I will get up at a public meeting and go out and sit with the people and give speeches against you. And you'll do it over my dead body, that type of thing. So there was a lot of screaming and yelling, but I had good.
You're a real charmer sometimes, aren't you?
Sometimes. Call me a flame. The Philadelphia Inquirer called me a flamethrower. But anyway, we did not cut. We raised the taxes, and we took tremendous amount of heat, right, raising those property taxes. Because people just don't understand. They didn't understand the complexities of the formula and what was happening. Now, to give you another example, in Philadelphia, next door, they were losing tons of money because it was an equalizer. They were losing a lot more than I was. They cut their guidance counselors. They cut their nurses. They cut art. They cut music. They cut libraries. It was horrible. The poorest kids in the universe, and that's what happened to them there. This case went to court, and it was thrown out once, and then it was put back in again, and the trial finally ended just a few months ago. But the Education Law Center, lawyers at the University of Pennsylvania, had the numbers for my 15 years while I was superintendent. We lost $47 million from the state that should have showed up. Now, divide that by 15 and we're losing $3 million a year. Where do you get that money? And it came out of property taxes. You have to translate that number too. $47 million in the 80s might be crazy number today, like losing $150 million today. Philadelphia, in that 15 years, that same period, lost $1 billion. $1 billion. So, they just didn't have the courage to do the property taxes, and they did all these cuts. Horrible stories of kids not getting into colleges because there were no guidance counselors to help them. There were some deaths from school nurses being cut. Today, still in Philadelphia, they're talking to have schools closed because the asbestos has never been removed. It's friable now and it's leaking down or drying down. Just a horrible story. But anyway, in the court case, the lawyers for the defendants, that's the state, the state legislature, said that money doesn't matter. It's absolutely incredible. For any business, any industry, money matters greatly, and it certainly matters in education. But they use that argument, and it did not fly. The state lost the case. I wrote an article on it, state found guilty, which is hard to believe that a state could be found guilty of underfunding schools. And the judge's solution was fix it. So we're waiting to see. You're not going to fix this in a year, but hopefully year after year after year, it will get remedied. Horrible.
That's an amazing story. And one, I followed the school closures in Philadelphia, certainly, and then the strikes and things like that. And then I've paid a little bit of attention to the Kensington neighborhood and its challenges and also just some of the bright spots that are there in terms of community. So I paid a little bit of attention, but I did not recognize that this was happening. And what a good lesson, particularly since you were victorious in terms of for children, what that might mean across the nation. In Missouri, for example, my school district spent $13 million on busing. We received 1.8 back from the state. We were supposed to get 75% to 80% of our funding, but yet we were getting 18%. And so that might be somewhat of a playbook or a game plan for states all across the nation to be able to begin looking at their taking their states to courts and their legislators to court.
There was a group of school districts. I think there were 6, as well as some private entities, and that's all it took to get the thing through the court system and get a ruling for all 500 school districts.
Fascinating. In an effort to be guided by the 6 questions that I always ask guests, let's conclude with what's something that went well. And when you look back on your 15 years in the superintendency, of what are a few major initiatives that you have pushed for, whether early in your career or later in your career, something that had a positive influence during your 15 years as superintendent and well into the future, what would you say that is?
You mentioned early childhood learning and vocabulary, and I brought in all the kindergarten teachers, and they thought they were all going to get fired or something, that you don't get called into the superintendent's office. And we had the room set up, and we had a wall up, and behind the wall I had pastries and coffee and tea. They didn't know that, and they were really shaky. And we opened the wall, and I told them that the most valuable people in the school district were the ones my early childhood teachers, because they could do so much for a kid at that age and change the kid's life with a 5-year-old and so on. And they were all smiling and they were all happy. And we opened the gate and they were all eating cake and tea. And they said to me, "We don't want to go home. We want to sit down for a second." I hadn't planned on this at all. And they had been talking while they were having their cake and cookies. And some of their leaders said to me that in talking to each other, they discovered great inequalities in kindergartens in schools. Some had much more educationally, many more resources to do things with the very young children. And they said to me, "What can you do about this?" So I said, "Well, let me think about this," or whatever. So I got this idea of maybe if we put all the kindergarten kids in one place, they would all have the same resources. But I didn't know whether that would work. So I empowered a bunch of teachers, led by a secondary teacher, because I wanted no bias, to go research this. And they researched, and they found a couple of kindergarten centers and visited and came back with rave reviews. And so we did a lot of community education and told people we're going to put all the kindergartens in one place because it was going to be the greatest kindergarten center in the world. And so we opened that, and we had a closed school, which was perfect. So all the kindergartens from all our elementary schools fit in that one place. They got bussed in for half a day, and there was daycare there. So we worked that out with the township so that it wasn't hardship for a parent Your kid would get bused to kindergarten, do the half day, and then could go to daycare till 4 or 5 o'clock. It was a tremendous success, and it equalized students. And it just worked out well. And then we were able to put tremendous resources because we all needed one place.
The fact that you brought people together, your early learning team, created an opportunity for them to give you genuine feedback on what was working and maybe not working. And that became the impetus for creating an early childhood center for kindergartners in the district that both was efficient in terms of resource allocation, but also became a really promising place for everyone to come together so that you weren't going to have these real discrepancies between and among schools. My guest again today was Joe Batory, former superintendent of Upper Darby School District, an award-winning leader, an advocate for social justice, an author, and humanitarian. And Joe, in our correspondence leading up to today's conversation, I knew I was going to meet somebody who was dynamic, reflective, proud of the things he had accomplished over a distinguished career. And while you told me that you are not directly descended from the Polish king Stefan Batory, I have to say that in terms of educational leadership, I think you can rightly claim to be of Pennsylvania royalty. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Peter. It's a wonderful show you have here.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.